In the shadowy corridors of medieval history, some monarchs swore their crowns with pride but bore secrets too heavy to speak aloud. Among them was a man whose heart defied his age, whose throne stood tall but whose soul lived quietly in the corners of candlelit halls. His name was William II, son of the legendary conqueror who forever changed England. Known to history as William Rufus for the reddish hue of his hair and complexion, he was the eldest surviving son of William the Conqueror, the mighty duke who had crossed the Channel in 1066 and reshaped a kingdom with steel and fire. But his son would not follow in his father's martial footsteps. Instead, William inherited England, the crown jewel of the Norman Empire, and brought with him not thunderous armies, but a private court of whisper and intrigue. From the moment he took the throne, William was a king apart. The nobles found him irreverent, the clergy found him sacrilegious, and the commoners found him burdensome. He taxed heavily, ruled firmly, and laughed too freely in the face of church authority. But what truly set him apart, what drew both fascination and fury, was not his politics, but his private passions. Behind the thick stone walls of royal chambers, William surrounded himself with beautiful young courtiers. They dressed not in the modest fashions of Norman knighthood, but in flamboyant silks, pointed shoes, and flowing hair. To many, the court seemed more like a stage, and William, the leading man in a play of desire and defiance. He never married, he sired no children, and whispers grew louder with each passing year that the king was not merely disinterested in women, but deeply and exclusively enamored with men. In an age when such love was condemned as heresy, when to love differently could mean damnation, William's openness was, to some, scandalous. The Church, already suspicious of his policies, turned cold. Chroniclers accused him of indulgence, of immorality, and most of all, of the sin of sodomy, a label used to destroy lives in the name of divine purity. But the Red King paid little heed. His court remained resplendent, his favorites remained at his side, and his brothers, especially Henry, the youngest, watched from afar, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in the summer of 1100, deep within the New Forest, a royal hunting ground shrouded in both beauty and mystery. It was a warm day when William rode out, bow in hand, unaware that it would be his last. No bard sings of what truly happened, no record confirms the killer, but when the sun fell that day, so too did the king. An arrow pierced his chest. Whether it flew by accident or design remains one of England's great unsolved riddles. The man who loosed the fatal shot, Walter Tyrrell, fled into the forest. William's companions abandoned him. His body, kingly no more, lay alone among the moss and trees, until peasants he had taxed and ruled, found him. They loaded the corpse onto a cart and brought him to Winchester, where kings were meant to rest with honor. But honor would not follow William into death. He was denied a Christian burial, his soul rejected by the very church he had mocked. In death, as in life, he remained an outsider, a ruler whose desires made him a stranger to his own kingdom. When Henry, his brother, ascended the throne just days later, he moved swiftly. William's favorites were banished, their hair forcibly cut in a symbolic act of cleansing the court. The past would be buried, even if the king was not. And yet, history remembers, in an age of persecution and silence, William II stood, perhaps unknowingly, as one of the earliest monarchs believed to have loved beyond the strict norms of his time. His reign was short, his rule was troubled, but his life, lived boldly, loved fiercely, remains a quiet act of rebellion echoing through centuries. In tales of valor and conquest, few names shimmer as brightly as Richard the Lionheart, a king whose sword carved legend across continents, yet whose heart may have whispered in the shadows to someone not found in courtly ballads. Born the third son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard was never meant to rule, but fate, and a series of family betrayals, would draw him from the vineyards of Aquitaine to the throne of England. Tall, nearly 2 meters in height, with golden hair and a commanding voice, he was the very image of a storybook knight. He spent much of his youth in southern France, far from the English court. His mother, Eleanor, fierce and brilliant, raised him among the poets and troubadours of Aquitaine, a land where chivalry mingled with longing, and where romantic ideals of love transcended tradition. At the age of 22, Richard did what few princes dared. He rose in armed rebellion against his father. But he was not alone. He formed an alliance with a young monarch who would come to mean more than just political advantage, King Philip II of France. What began as strategy soon became the center of centuries of speculation. One chronicler, Roger of Hoveden, left behind a passage that has echoed through history. He wrote that Richard and Philip ate every day at the same table and from the same dish, and at night, their beds were not separated. The King of France loved Richard as his own soul. To some modern ears, these words speak of love in its fullest sense. To others, they are courtly metaphors, florid phrases of medieval diplomacy. But whatever truth lies beneath, the bond between Richard and Philip was deep, personal, and undeniable. When Richard's elder brothers died, the crown passed to him. At 32, he became King of England, though his heart remained far from its shores. Within months, he launched the Third Crusade, vowing to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem. He was a lion in battle, fearless, commanding, and glorified by his enemies and allies alike. Yet the crusade would bring both triumph and tragedy. Though he showed military brilliance, Richard never captured Jerusalem. Along the way, he may have sought comfort in brief relationships with women. There is record of at least one illegitimate son, but with his queen, Berengaria of Navarre, he shared little time and no children. On his return journey from the Holy Land, fate intervened again. Disguised and traveling through Europe, Richard was recognized, captured, and held for ransom by Leopold, Duke of Austria. The cost of his freedom, £100,000, a sum so vast it equaled 8 years of England's total tax revenue. His capture nearly bankrupted the kingdom. And still, England was not his home. He returned briefly, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on war, on France, on Philip. But not all stories end in glory. During a siege at Chaillot-Chabrol, in the heart of France, Richard, ever reckless, wandered the battlements without armor. A crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. Infection set in, gangrene, slow and merciless. His final days were spent in agony, his once mighty body failing. He died in his mother's arms. Richard reigned for 9 years, but spent less than 6 months in England. A king in name, but a knight by soul. He is remembered in bronze and verse as the Lionheart, the warrior king. But within that lion beat a human heart, full of contradiction, longing, and perhaps, love unspoken. He left no heir, he left no peace, but he left behind the question, still echoing in cathedral stones and dusty parchment. What did Richard love most, glory, God, or someone who once shared his bed in the flickering candlelight of a French palace? In the long line of England's kings, Edward II stands apart, not for his triumphs, but for his tenderness, and the quiet defiance of a love that refused to hide. He was born into greatness, the son of Edward I, the fierce and towering king known as Longshanks, who built castles across Wales and broke the spirit of Scotland. But where his father was iron and fire, Edward II was flesh and feeling, a gentle spirit born into a brutal world. From an early age, his father saw the difference and tried to harden the boy with the rigors of court and campaign. He sent knights and tutors to shape him. Among them was a young nobleman named Piers Gaveston, handsome, witty, bold, but rather than tough, and the prince, Gaveston, won his heart. Their connection was instant, electric. They read poetry, rode together, whispered under stone arches by moonlight. The chroniclers of the time could not help but notice, though most did not dare to name what they saw. Edward was enamored, not with war, but with companionship, and not with women, but with Piers. When his father discovered the closeness, he banished Gaveston, hoping distance would sever what affection could not. But fate was relentless. Edward I died, and the 23-year-old prince became king. His first act? He summoned Gaveston back. What followed was a reign shaped by love, and doomed by it. Edward gave peers titles, riches, and honours meant for princes. At the royal coronation, Gaveston wore the Queen's jewels, and walked as though he were England's second king. The barons seethed. The Queen herself, Isabella of France, watched silently, her all clear, but her place never quite certain. The nobility could not tolerate a royal favourite who wore purple and laughed too loudly. They saw it not just as favouritism, but as an affront to their ancient power, and so they acted. A group led by the Earl of Lancaster captured Gaveston. He was stabbed and beheaded, not in war, but in a field far from court. Edward was devastated. His grief was not political, it was personal. The heart of a king had been broken. England began to unravel. The king's relationship with his nobles turned to ashes. Scotland rose against him, and won. Crops failed, and famine swept the land, turning hunger into rage. Priests blamed it on the king's sins. Whispers of immorality and divine punishment spread like wildfire. And then came Hugh Despenser. Edward, lonely and clinging to the memory of peers, found comfort again, this time in Hugh, a clever and ruthless courtier. It was said that Despenser shared more than Edward's trust. Once again, the barons rose. Despenser was captured, executed, and mutilated, his body desecrated in a public display of rage and righteousness. The king's enemies did not stop there. His own queen, Isabella, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, turned against him. She took a lover of her own, Roger Mortimer, and together they raised an army. Edward was deposed, imprisoned in cold stone chambers, and murdered in the dark, in a manner so cruel it still chills the blood. The records say he was killed with a red-hot iron, a final act of symbolic hatred. But even in death, no evidence can extinguish the humanity he carried, the love he held, quiet and unashamed, in the face of a world that would not understand. Edward II was many things: a failed king, a tragic figure, and perhaps, most simply, a man who loved deeply, and dared to love differently. His reign ended in humiliation, but his story endures, as a whispered lament in the margins of history. A king who ruled with feeling, and who lost everything for the crime of loving another man. The crown weighed heavy on his head, not just because he wore it too young, but because he wore it in a world that had little patience for softness, beauty, or love. Richard II became king at the tender age of 10. His father, the heroic Black Prince, had died before ascending the throne, and so, when his grandfather, Edward III, passed away, a child, fragile, quiet, and deeply thoughtful, was thrust into power. In the England he inherited, death was never far. The Black Death had claimed 1/3 of the population. The fields were quiet, the labourers were few, and in the silence, change was coming. With so many peasants gone, those who survived found themselves more valuable. They asked for better wages, more freedom, a better life, and for the first time, the old noble order felt threatened. To hold power, Parliament taxed the people heavily, once, then again, and then a third time. The final tax, meant to fill the royal treasury, instead set the countryside ablaze. What followed became known as the Peasants' Revolt. Fires rose, manors burned, armies of workers marched under banners demanding equality, not to destroy the king, but to stand beside him. They believed he was good, that he would understand. And in a moment of quiet courage, Richard, just 14 years old, did something few kings would dare. He rode out to meet the rebels alone. Their leader, Wat Tyler, was killed in the melee. Tension surged. Bows were drawn. But Richard held firm. He raised his hand and spoke softly. "You shall have no leader but me. I am your king. I will be your justice." For that moment, he was truly a monarch, not by blood, but by trust, and the rebels believed him. they dispersed peacefully, returning home in hope. But Richard would not keep his promise. Within weeks, his government hunted them down, and the rebellion was crushed in blood. The boy king who had once spoken gently would be changed forever. As he grew older, so too did the whispers. Richard surrounded himself with a court of cultured, refined men, poets, scholars, and elegant courtiers who prized beauty over battle. He was called effeminate, mocked for his delicate features, his love of art, and a faint lisp. One name rose above the rest: Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, later made Duke of Ireland, a title never before granted to a man outside the royal family. De Vere was no general, no prince, but he was Richard's favorite, perhaps his lover. Their bond angered the nobility. It frightened them. When de Vere led Richard's forces against a rival faction of barons, he fled the battlefield, leaving the royal army in ruins. Parliament condemned him. He escaped abroad, but his death soon followed, and when his body was returned to England, Richard did the unthinkable. He ordered the coffin opened, reached inside, and kissed de Vere's hand, gazing upon the face of a man he had not stopped loving. The act stunned the court. It was not politics. It was grief, intimate, honest, dangerous. The nobles had seen enough. Led by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, they seized power. Richard was forced to abdicate, stripped of his crown, imprisoned, and finally murdered, likely starved to death in a cold cell. He died alone. He was 32 years old. In life, Richard had been a dreamer, an aesthete in an age of iron, a poet born to rule a battlefield, and perhaps he loved in a way that his world could not tolerate. Whether de Vere was his companion or confidant, the emotion between them was real, and it became his undoing. Richard's fall was not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a new England, harsher, more pragmatic, and less forgiving of kings who dared to feel too much. But in that final embrace with the man he loved, Richard left behind a quiet legacy, a testament to the truth that kings, even crowned and armored, are human still. When Queen Elizabeth I died childless in 1603, England's long Tudor chapter closed. The woman who had ruled alone for over 4 decades left no heir, only questions: who would take her place? Who could hold together the fragile union of faith, crown, and country? The answer came not from England, but from Scotland, a realm long considered wild and separate. Riding south was a man fluent in theology and power, raised in the cold stone palaces of Edinburgh, and shaped by loneliness from birth. He was James VI of Scotland, now to become James I of England, and with his coronation, 2 kingdoms were joined under one crown. From a distance, James seemed everything a Protestant monarch should be: learned, devout, steady. He spoke like a preacher and wrote like a philosopher. He had survived assassination attempts, court conspiracies, and the beheading of his own mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been executed at the order of his predecessor, Elizabeth. But beneath the robes of majesty was a man of curious contradictions. James was deeply religious, yet privately indulgent. He preached morality, yet his own desires often strayed into forbidden territory. He ruled by divine right, yet yearned for affection and approval in deeply human ways. His first known infatuation came when he was just 13. The object of his fascination, his much older cousin, Esme Stuart, a charismatic nobleman newly returned from France. James was mesmerized. Witnesses described how he wrapped his arms around Esme in public, kissed him, and refused to be parted. At court, they walked side by side. At night, it was whispered, they were never far apart. Esme was made Duke of Lennox, granted lands and titles, but the Scottish nobility would not have it. Suspecting Catholic leanings and scandalous intimacy, they forced Stuart into exile. James was devastated. But the pattern had been set. As King of England, James had a wife, Anne of Denmark, and with her, he fathered 8 children. Their marriage was warm, even affectionate, yet it was not Anne, but a series of young male courtiers, who seemed to capture the king's deeper passions. Most famously, there was Robert Carr, a strikingly handsome man with limited intellect and unlimited charm. James made him Earl of Somerset, showered him with wealth and responsibility, but scandal followed. Carr's wife was implicated in a murder, and when evidence pointed to Carr himself, James pardoned him, though the stain never lifted. Then came George Villiers, 20 years James's junior, confident, elegant, and ambitious. The king adored him. He was given the title Duke of Buckingham, elevated to positions of immense power, and granted a private passage connecting their bedchambers. The nobility grumbled, Parliament erupted, yet James remained steadfast. One contemporary wrote that Elizabeth had been a king in spirit, while James had become a queen in soul. The line was meant as an insult, but it may have captured a truth no one dared to say aloud. Still, James was no romantic idealist. In public, he punished homosexuality with severity, allowing harsh laws to be used against his subjects, even as he ignored those same rules for himself. He ruled during turbulent times. It was under his watch that the Gunpowder Plot was uncovered, a Catholic plan to blow up Parliament and the king himself. Guy Fawkes, caught beneath the House of Lords with barrels of gunpowder, became both traitor and legend. To this day, his failed plot is remembered every November 5, with bonfires and burning effigies. And yet, James also left a quieter, more lasting legacy. Under his patronage, the King James Bible was published, a translation that shaped English language and Protestant thought for generations. It remains one of the most read and poetic texts in history. When James died at age 58, his reign had lasted over 2 decades. He had unified crowns, survived conspiracies, and reshaped religious life in Britain. And in death, he made one final gesture. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, where 2 tombs rest nearby, one for Esme Stuart, the man who captured his heart as a boy, and one for George Villiers, the last to hold his affection as a king. James I was many things: a scholar, a builder of empires, a contradictory and often difficult monarch, but in the quiet moments of his reign, in letters, glances, and gestures, he revealed something rare for his time. That even the most powerful kings sometimes yearned simply to be loved. By the end of the 17th century, England had become a land wearied by war, division, and the relentless struggle between crown and conscience. The nation had endured rebellion, civil war, and the execution of one king. It had suffered the autocracy of another. When at last a Catholic king, James II, rose to power, many feared that the old battles of faith and monarchy would ignite again. But there would be no great war, no rivers of blood this time. Instead, there came what the English would call the Glorious Revolution. And at its center stood a quiet, serious man, more comfortable with maps than masks, more drawn to diplomacy than to dance. He was William of Orange, a Protestant prince from the Netherlands. His claim to the throne came through his mother, Mary Stuart, daughter of King Charles I. But it was his marriage to Mary, the Protestant daughter of James II, that gave England an answer to its crisis. They did not seize power, they were invited to it. In 1688, Parliament sent word across the North Sea, "Come to England, take the crown, and restore balance." And so, William and Mary sailed not as invaders, but as protectors of Parliament, Protestantism, and order. When James II fled the country, Parliament declared the throne vacant, and a new chapter began, with William and Mary crowned as co-monarchs. But even from the beginning, it was clear, Mary held the warmth, William held the reins. He was not a man easily moved. His demeanor was cold, his speech blunt, raised in the courts of The Hague. He had learned to guard emotion behind layers of formality. Yet those who knew him best spoke of a different William, a man of deep affections, loyal friendships, and quiet, consuming attachments. At the heart of his private world were 2 men, Hans Willem Bentinck, his childhood friend and constant companion, and later, Arnold Joost van Keppel, a young Dutch page who would rise with astonishing speed to become Earl of Albemarle. Rumors swirled. Whispers filled the corridors of Whitehall. Bentinck was older, trusted, and dignified. Perhaps the first love. Keppel, by contrast, was 20 years younger, graceful, charming, and fiercely protective of the king's solitude. William granted him lands, titles, and honors usually reserved for seasoned nobility. The English aristocracy fumed, but William, aloof and politically astute, rarely explained himself. His court remained formal, his expressions guarded, yet late at night, candlelight sometimes flickered between the king's chamber and Keppel's, connected by a private passage. Then, in 1694, everything changed. Queen Mary fell ill with smallpox. She died at just 32 years old, leaving behind no children. The kingdom mourned, and so did William, deeply, sincerely. Their marriage, though likely never romantic, had been one of partnership. Now, he ruled alone. After her death, gossip about William's relationships intensified. Mary's sister, Princess Anne, said bluntly that his heart is not for women. William never remarried. His public life became quieter, his health more fragile. Still, he fought on, against the French abroad, and against Jacobite plots at home. He protected Protestant power and the constitutional monarchy. His victories at the Battle of the Boyne and his calm in the face of assassination attempts made him a hero to some, especially in Ireland, where his triumph over James II is still commemorated. But for all his public strength, William's private world grew smaller. He spent more time in the Netherlands. He left governing to ministers. His bond with Keppel remained unspoken in letters, but obvious in action. He entrusted him with ships, armies, and titles, far beyond what the young man's experience justified. Parliament tried to have Keppel removed. William refused. And then came the accident. In 1702, while riding his horse at Hampton Court, William fell. The injury, seemingly minor, led to pneumonia. Within weeks, the king was dead. He was 51 years old. William died without an heir, ending the male line of the House of Orange in England. The crown passed to Anne, and with it, the final shift into a modern, parliamentary monarchy. But before his tomb was sealed, William left one last instruction. He was to be buried at Westminster Abbey, not beside his wife, but within reach of the men who had shaped his heart. To this day, Hans Bentinck and Arnold van Keppel rest nearby. William III was no romantic. He was no poet. But perhaps, in the margins of history, he was a man who loved, not in declarations or sonnets, but in loyalty, protection, and proximity. And though the fires of revolution had spared his crown, they could not spare him from the judgment of a world still unwilling to see love as love. She was never meant to rule. She was a shy second daughter, often ill, often overlooked, raised in a royal household more concerned with bloodlines than with the lonely girl watching from behind velvet curtains. But in the turbulent twilight of the Stuart dynasty, all others had either died or fallen from grace, and so, when the last of the Protestant heirs reached the throne, it was Anne, Queen of England, Scotland, and, soon, Great Britain. History remembers her for many things: for uniting the kingdoms, for a war she did not want, for the end of an era. But behind the heavy crown and court ritual lived a woman marked by deep sorrow and, perhaps, a kind of love the world did not then recognize. She was married, dutifully, to Prince George of Denmark, a man of few ambitions and fewer words. They shared a life, a household, and perhaps companionship, but passion, that belonged elsewhere. Anne endured 17 pregnancies, a cruel parade of miscarriages, stillbirths, and short-lived children. Only one son, Prince William, survived infancy, and he too was taken, claimed by smallpox at the age of 11. The grief was unspeakable. It settled into her body, twisting her spine, weakening her limbs. and likely hastening the illness that would later confine her to a wheelchair. Doctors now believe she suffered from Hughes syndrome, a blood disorder that made her pregnancies tragically doomed from the start. A modern medicine like aspirin might have saved them, but in her time, there was only prayer and loss. Through this haze of heartache, one figure stood beside her, Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough. Beautiful, brilliant, politically sharp, Sarah was everything Anne was not. The two women shared a closeness that defied the stiff formality of the court. They wrote to each other constantly. Anne's letters were tender, emotional, almost desperate in tone. She signed them "Your faithful, ever-loving Anne," and called Sarah Mrs. Freeman, a private name used only between them. Sarah called her Mrs. Morley. These pet names, used in secret, were part of a world within a world, where queen and confidant spoke not as sovereign and subject, but as something softer, intimate, familiar. Sarah's husband, John Churchill, was a famed general, and his military victories brought power, but it was Sarah's presence in Anne's heart that gave her true influence. For years, she shaped court policy, appointments, even foreign strategy. She was, many whispered, the second most powerful woman in England. But power and love rarely hold hands for long. Sarah grew bold, too bold. She lectured the Queen on politics, religion, war. She mocked Anne's illnesses, criticized her wardrobe, and pushed her into battles she no longer believed in. Slowly, Anne pulled away, and in that silence, someone else stepped in. Her name was Abigail Masham, Sarah's cousin and the opposite in every way. Where Sarah was proud, Abigail was quiet. Where Sarah argued, Abigail listened. She was gentle, patient, and never sought the spotlight. And in that gentleness, Anne found peace. What passed between them in private remains a mystery, but the fallout was clear. Anne banished Sarah from court, cutting her off with the same finality as a broken vow. Abigail, now the Queen's favorite, stayed by her side. The political world roared. Sarah accused Abigail of seduction. Pamphlets were printed. Rumors ran wild. But Anne never responded. She left no declarations, no explanations, only actions. By now, the Queen was ailing, her body swollen, her breath short, her spirit heavy. She watched as her final hope, the young Prince William, faded from life. With no heir, the succession fell not to love, but to law. The Act of Settlement, passed years earlier, had ensured that no Catholic would ever again wear the crown. The nearest Protestant relative was Sophia of Hanover, though she was 80 years old. She died 2 months before Anne, and so, when the Queen finally passed, aged 49, worn down by grief and pain, the throne moved to George I, a German prince she had never met. It was the end of the Stuart line, the end of an era of kings and queens who dared, in quiet and sometimes costly ways, to love beyond the limits imposed upon them. And though Anne left no diaries of passion, no confessions, no children, she left behind a story, a life filled with unspoken affection, with longing and loyalty, a life where love, though never named, was felt deeply. Perhaps more than any other monarch of her age, Anne ruled with feeling, and in the candlelit silence of her court, behind all the ceremony and pain, she may have found, if only briefly, someone who simply made her feel seen. Across centuries, these monarchs, kings and queens of one of the world's most enduring dynasties, held power, waged wars, and shaped nations. But beneath the crowns and commands were hearts, beating with affection, with longing, with love that did not always fit the mold history made for them. They were punished, silenced, cast aside. Their names survived, but their loves were buried beneath layers of caution, shame, or denial. Yet today, in a more open age, we begin to unearth their truths, not to scandalize them, but to honor their humanity. Because no matter how gilded the throne, no matter how vast the kingdom, love remains the most powerful legacy of all.